My name is Bryan Hughes. I actually am a doctor, something I tend to forget about a lot of the time. I'm Nearform, basically everywhere online, and I work for Microsoft, where I work on debugging tools for Node. And I'm also on the Node.js Technical Steering Committee. And yeah, we're going to talk about the community. But first, what is the Node community? This is something I think everyone has kind of a different idea of what the community is. And it's actually kind of hard to define, as it turns out. So first, what even is an open source community? Is it like a social group? Some people kind of use open source as a way to collaborate with others and just kind of spend time hanging out with friends. Some view it as like a hacker collective where it's all about the technology. And then for other people still, Node or open source communities are like workplaces. It's where we come to get work done and to create products. And it's really all of these things. And some of us identify with some of these more than others. But taken as a whole, it's all of these and more. And if we look at the Node community itself, it's both the technology, the founding technology of it. We're talking about like Node, we're talking about NPM, but it's also the ecosystem. The Node community as we know it really has a lot to do with NPM and all the modules out there. All those modules that we published and that we use from each other. This creates community kind of inherently. It's we start recognizing certain authors on modules, and we start seeing the same names and faces kind of cropping up. And the Node community is really a mixture of different types of people too. There's a lot of people who are enthusiasts, people who like to hack on Node in their spare time, coming up with just some cool, off-the-wall, fun project. But there's also people who work at startups who are using Node to create, the next big app, something that's going to, maybe change the world. And there's also the people who work in enterprise who are using Node to go to really massive scale. And all of these people are part of the Node community. And most importantly, they're from all around the world. Node is in multiple continents. Node is even in space now, which is pretty awesome. But it's everywhere, and there's this huge diversity of people that make up the Node community. And really, it's kind of a loose confederation, though. We talk about the Node community as if it's a single organism, but there's really a whole bunch of sub-communities that make up what we think of as the Node community. There are people who work on robotics, for example, in the Johnny 5 community, which is kind of where I sort of come from. But then there are also people who are working in machine learning within Node, and and so on and so forth. And so there's all these different communities that they kind of overlap, but they are still kind of distinctly different, and thus have different motivations. And so where did we come from? How did the Node community get started? If you've been around Node for a long time, this is probably old news, but we actually have a lot of new people in Node. I think I remember seeing something like half of all Node users started within the last year. And so a lot of people actually don't know the history of Node very well. So back in 2009, a guy named Ryan Dahl created Node.js, and he first demoed it at JSConfEU back then. And he kind of created it in his spare time as just a passion project, and kind of worked on it that way for a little while. But it soon became clear that something else was needed. So in 2010, a company called Joyent came in and decided to sponsor the project. They saw the promise of Node, and they really wanted to see it succeed. So they brought Ryan Dahl on as a full-time employee at Joyent, and they hired him specifically to work on Node. And they also provided infrastructure and things like that. And they also began to hire some other people as well. One of the first early hires at Joyent was a guy named Isaac Schluter, who later that year created the NPM client and the first registry. Now, this was long before the company existed. This was actually done as part of Joyent back at that time. But this was still the early stage. This is really critical for Node because it really was NPM that allowed Node to grow just as rapidly as it has. It was this ability to share modules and distribute code really easily that made it so easy to get started in Node. Of course, there were still some issues with Node. Back in the early days, it didn't support Windows at all. And so Microsoft stepped in 2011 and actually put some resources towards the project so that Node could get supported on Windows. And this is also really important because last time I checked, about half of all Node developers develop on Windows. Even though I think most of us here are probably using Macs, but there actually are a lot of Windows developers out there. And before we got Windows support, they were just kind of left out in the cold, and there was a whole segment that wasn't being reached. But there was a fair amount of work that was needed to get this to work. In Node.js at the time, there was this library called libev under the hood that provided, networking file, the event loop, all that sort of stuff. And it was very Unix specific. So it actually had to be ripped out and was replaced with a new project at the time called libuv. And libuv was architected so that it could be run on multiple platforms. So then we're going along. 2012 rolls around, and we end up with a leadership change. Randall had been leading the project up until this point, but he decided that he wanted to go work on new things, and so he actually left the project around that time. And so this is when Isaac Schluter stepped up as the new BDFL. BDFL is short for Benevolent Dictator for Life, and it just turns out that for life means about 2 years in the Node community. But yeah, so Isaac steps up, and the project's going on. We're starting to get some new releases out there. Node's still pretty rough around the edges back in these days. It's getting more stable, but there's just lots of edge cases. If you look at the way streams worked back then and events, there were a lot of gotchas, and just in general, it was a lot of bugs, things like that. But it was an early project. So things go along. It's getting more stable, things like that. So we kind of jump ahead to 2014. And this is when NPM Incorporated, the company, was first founded. And this was actually a really big moment. Isaac Schluter stepped away, and him, along with a few others, founded the company. And there's a couple reasons they did this. One is, well, of course, you found a company because you want to find some success. But another reason they did this was to help the NPM registry. This is something I think a lot of people tend to forget because this was several years ago now, but the registry was actually really struggling back then. It wasn't very stable. It tended to go down a lot. I actually remember one time at the company I was working at a few years ago, we had to delay a product launch by a full day because the registry was down, and we couldn't launch our product. And this was just kind of somewhat par for the course back then. And so by founding NPM, they were able to get a lot of VC funding in, and they were able to really ramp up the infrastructure for the registry and stabilize it and make it something that people could rely on. And so in a lot of ways, the founding of NPM kind of saved Node, which is something we kind of forget about these days, but it was pretty important. But when Isaac stepped away, a guy named TJ Fontaine stepped up, and he took over as the BDFL for Node. Like I said, about 2 years seems to be the best we've gotten out of the BDFL. So things are going along. NPM is getting really stable at this point in time. Node 0.10 had come out, which was kind of the first really stable version of Node, something that enterprises could rely on. And so Node's starting to look like it's in a pretty good position. But there was a problem. If we look at the number of contributions over time, which is this graph here, this is the graph of contributions of Node for its entire existence. We can see we start off small, and it kind of starts getting pretty big. But then in 2011 or so, it starts to go down. We get fewer and fewer contributions. And by the time we get to 2014, there's really not much going on. Node had kind of stagnated, as it turns out. And this was for a variety of reasons, just some structural things about the way the project was run. It made it hard to bring in new collaborators. And it wasn't really set up to encourage people to continue collaborating. And because of some of these structural issues, it was really hard to work around them. And so in 2014, a number of people decided to fork the project. And they actually created a new fork, and they called it IO.js. And when they did this, not only did they fork the code, they created a brand new governance structure. And this governance structure was based on the concept of open source, which was first proposed by Rod Vag, who is one of the key people in Node these days. And the idea of open source is that anytime you land some significant contribution to Node, you're automatically added as a collaborator. You're given commit access. Collaborators aren't put up for a vote, or there's no vetting process. It's just if you do the work, you're in. And by making it that simple, that sort of democratized development to a pretty large extent in Node.js. And so people started flooding in. You can see right after the fork happened, we got this huge spike of contributors. And so this is really great. But of course, the problem with this is we've got this new project that has all the development going on, and it's what has all the developers excited. But businesses that are relying on Node in production aren't going to deploy a fork. They're sticking with Node.js. And so of course this future wasn't really tenable. And so everything merged back together in 2015 when we created the Node.js Foundation. So Joyent sort of handed over the project to the foundation, and the foundation adopted the open governance model of IOJS, and this really has set the course for future success. At this point, there's a lot fewer weak points. The project isn't dependent on a single startup that may or may not exist in 5 or 10 years, because that's the nature of startups. Nothing against Joyent. And so this is kind of where we are now with the foundation. So, I talked about the Node Foundation. I'm sure you've heard it a lot before, but what actually is the foundation? I found a lot of people don't really know a lot about how the foundation works, so I kind of want to run through it a little bit. So this is their mission statement, and I'm just going to read it real quick. The Node.js Foundation's mission is to enable widespread adoption and accelerate development of Node.js and other related modules through an open governance model that encourages participation, technical contribution, and a framework for long-term stewardship by an ecosystem invested in Node.js. So there's a lot of kind of little things in here to look at. One of the big things, so the foundation, of course, wants to make Node succeed, kind of in the very broad strokes. And the way that the foundation thinks it can achieve this is through encouraging collaborators into the project. That's the open governance model. We want to make sure that we have people developing the project itself. And then also, we want to make sure that the ecosystem is healthy over time, too. And so this requires not just people coding, but also outreach and various other things like that. And finally, we want to make sure that this happens over the long term. So we want to make sure there aren't any single points of failure, things like that. And so the foundation is created up of a whole bunch of different companies, so that if any one of them changes mission, strategy, goes under, whatever, the Node.js project can still live on. So this is the basic high-level structure of the foundation. At the top, we have a board of directors, like pretty much any foundation. And the board of directors is created of people from member companies. So what companies can do is they can become members of the foundation, and when they become members, they pay dues. And it's through these dues that the foundation gets its operating budgets. And depending on how much money they're paying in, companies can either elect a representative to the board, or they can work with other companies and find one representative to represent multiple companies. There's like a whole price structure to it. And so this board kind of represents its constituents that way. And also on the board, there are 2 representatives that were elected from the community. And they're there to represent sort of the community interests. And then underneath the board, there are 4 groups. There's the legal committee, responsible for legal issues, things like that. So for example, right now, we are considering changing the default license on the project from the MIT license to the Apache 2. There are some reasons we may want to do that. We're not sure where it's going to go, but the legal committee is investigating that because they're the experts and know better than we do. Finance committee is kind of self-explanatory, same thing with marketing. And finally, there's the technical steering committee. So the technical steering committee is what I'm on. This is kind of where I fit in the foundation. And the technical steering committee is responsible for overseeing the technical side of the project. Basically, they're responsible for everything on GitHub under the Node.js organization. Now, I have this little dotted line here between the board and the TSC. The reason that's there is the way the foundation is structured is that there's actually a kind of a separation between the TSC and board. There's actually some bylaws and regulations on what the board can and cannot tell the TSC to do, and vice versa. The board can make recommendations, but the TSC ultimately has to adopt it. And the reason that we have this kind of separation in place is to make sure that no one company can basically pay to play, that put in money so that they can affect the technical direction of the project. This ensures that all technical decisions are made for technical reasons, which is kind of how we want it to be. So we go over to the TSC itself. The TSC delegates pretty much all responsibilities to other groups. Underneath the TSC, there is in the CTC, which is short for Core Technical Committee. I know these names are kind of confusing. So the TSC is basically, the way to think of it is the TSC is responsible for the administrative process of the project. So we look at, for example, moderation falls under the TSC, as does bringing in new projects and things like that. But we don't really take on any technical issues. So the name's a bit of a misnomer. We're called the Technical Steering Committee and do nothing technical. But it turns out the name is in the bylaws and charter and stuff like this, so we're kind of stuck with it, but whatever. Then the CTC, the Core Technical Committee, is responsible for overseeing the actual technical parts of the project. So they kind of take on any big technical questions that can't easily be resolved in like a pull request or something like that. So let's say there's a contentious pull request, take modules, promises, stuff like that. We can't come to a decision there. Sometimes we'll have to like take stuff to a vote. Sometimes in the end, we have to say, we have to make a decision. Not everyone will be happy with it. And so it's the responsibility of the CTC to make that decision. And then the CTC also delegates a lot of its work as well. So it delegates to a number of working groups and teams. Working groups and teams are basically the same thing. The only difference is that there's a couple of requirements around how working groups function. You have to have rules around like how do you add new members, how do you vote, things like that, whereas teams are a little more freeform. Teams are basically, you can think of it as like a repository. So like LTS is a team, for example. Then also under the TSC, going back up, there's the Inclusivity Working Group. And the Inclusivity Working Group's charter is to increase inclusivity and diversity within the project. I come from the Inclusivity Working Group, and so that's kind of why I'm on the TSC, is I'm there to represent their interests. Now, there's an asterisk next to both the CTC and the Inclusivity Working Group. The reason for that is we're actually discussing changing the structure of both. With the CTC, we're considering merging the CTC and the TSC into a single group. We'll see how that happens, but a couple months from now, this graph will probably look different. And same thing with the Inclusivity Working Group. We're looking at migrating a lot of those things into the Foundation's TSC and other places. All right, so I mentioned inclusivity. I come from the Inclusivity Working Group, and so what is inclusivity in open source? A lot of people have a lot of different ideas on that, of what that should look like. So I kind of want to give my interpretation of this and what I think it should look like based on my experience in the Node community. So this is what I would say inclusivity is. And I would say an inclusive open source community makes it easier for people to contribute by creating a place where everyone is encouraged to be there. Okay, that sounds pretty simple. I mean, it sounds like something that we all want, right? But it turns out it's actually rather difficult to implement in practice once you get down to the nitty-gritty details of it. And the reason for this is because people's needs vary. Something that is a problem for one person isn't a problem for another, and vice versa. We all have our own limitations and our own strengths, basically. So a really good example of this would be language. The Node.js project is run in English, specifically with American Vernacular English. This is actually specified in a document somewhere, too. And this is fine that we made this decision. We have to work in some language, but this does benefit some people over others. So like me, I'm a native English speaker, so this is very easy for me to contribute. But for people who aren't native English speakers, this represents a barrier to entry. And like I said, this is going to happen no matter what because there isn't a universal language. But what does matter is the steps that we take to make the project more welcoming to people who don't speak English as a native language. If we held everything in audio or video calls, that makes it a lot harder because text is a lot easier for people to translate. So being cognizant of that kind of thing. And are we taking active steps to help those people contribute? Because if we don't, people notice these things. If we don't care at all about native English speakers, which I'm sure there's a number in this room, you can tell. I mean, you notice, and it can drive people away. And this is just one example. There's a whole bunch of other examples. Time zones are one. Racial issues can come up. Same thing with gender. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different aspects where some people are affected and not others. And that's just kind of the reality of the world that we have to work with. So I have 2 tips, and basically kind of 2 areas where I think we should really focus to increase the inclusivity of the Node project. And for the record, we don't do a bad job at this. I think we're better than most open source projects, but I think we still have a long ways to go. So the first is trust the ouch. So whenever someone is saying they're having problems contributing, or they're saying this is an issue, we should really try and listen to them instead of second-guessing them. It's kind of human nature for us, when someone says, oh, hey, this is a problem, and it's not a problem for us, our response is to say, oh, that's not a problem. I don't have this problem, therefore it's not a problem. And it's fine that we do this. Once again, human nature. But we need to recognize that this is kind of the way our brains work, and we need to try and work past that. We need to kind of give people the benefit of the doubt and say, OK, what can we do to help with this, instead of just dismissing them. And the other recommendation I have is to put people first. Some people would say that Node.js is a technical project, so we should only care about the technical side. I would say it's actually the other way around. We should care first and foremost about the people involved. This is why the fork happened, after all, was because we forked not because of some technical issue with it, but because the contributors were not empowered to contribute. It was a people problem. And so we should kind of keep focusing on people this way. A great example of this also would be in onboarding. So when we're onboarding someone into the project, we could just say, oh, hey, welcome to the project. Here's the issues. Have fun. Bye. But that's not a really good way to onboard. It's better for someone to take a lot of time, sit with them, walk them through, these are the issues, these are how we file them, this is how you do a PR. Oh, I think this issue would be a great first issue. Why don't you take this one? This is where the code base is. You want to look in these files. When you get to the PR, walk them through all these steps. Now, it takes a lot of time to do that, and we're all busy people, and we have limited time. But I would argue that taking time out of your schedule now will save a huge amount of time in the future. If you lose 1 week, but you gain a year of productivity out of a new person, that's an obvious win. And I really like to think of this as like unit tests. Unit tests take time to write. They take time out of the initial coding, but they save us time in the long run, because we can then start automatically validating. I think we all agree that unit tests are a great thing, and we need to think about people in the same way. So where are we going next? OK, this is probably obvious. I think everyone's been beating this to death. But enterprise is where I really see Node.js succeeding most next. And this is where I see us going and focusing. And we have to do this. If we really want Node.js to succeed, we have to succeed in the enterprise. The enterprise is where most developers are, and it's also where most of the money is. This is where they were scaling to millions of users and things like that. And we've already taken some really good steps to enable enterprise success. The formation of the foundation was a really important part of it, because enterprises, when they look at a technology, it's not just where is it now, but where do we think it'll be in 5, 10 years? And being under a foundation structure, there's a pretty good guarantee that the foundation will still be here 5, 10 years from now, which may or may not be the case with startups. Also, we have created the new release plan, the whole LTS plan that Miles is going to be talking about later. This is another really important part for enabling enterprises to succeed, because we have a very predictable release cycle and support cycle. And this is something that they can make long-term plans around. And I think we can continue to do even more work to enable enterprise. I think another one that we're going to start to see more of is the Internet of Things. And I know this is a big buzzword kind of thing, and some of us are probably tired of hearing it, but it really is a new market. And I think there's a lot of new opportunities. We have Node.js. It's gotten performant enough that we can actually run it on a lot of these devices. So we could definitely see, say, smart fridges being developed entirely in Node.js and using web technologies, for example. I definitely see that thing happening. And so then we need to look at, how can Node better enable those scenarios? And even if it's not running on device, Node is going to be powering backends for a lot of these IoT devices. And so, what ways can Node support that? And this is, kind of a more vague area. We don't have a really great story around this yet, but I think we can, and I think we will focus on that. We're going to see new technologies coming into Node itself. There's a lot of new features in JavaScript with ES 2015 and newer, and we're going to be integrating those into Node. I briefly mentioned earlier, like modules and promises. These are things that we are figuring out how to make work in Node and work well for Node. And we're going to continue seeing new features as well. I think we're going to be seeing better debugging tools, too. For a long time, debugging was sort of a thorn in the side of Node developers. But that story is getting better all the time, and it will continue to get a lot better. And finally, better performance. If you look at the performance difference between Node 0.10 and Node 4, it's really dramatic, actually. So upgrading to Node 4, in addition to getting bug fixes, things like that, you also get better performance. And even the difference between Node 4 and Node 6, there's a measurable difference as well. And so we're going to just continue increasing the performance of Node. And finally, we're going to be looking at more contributors. We've had a pretty rapid growth of contributors recently, since we forked. But we're going to continue to bring on any more, and we need to, because we still need more people than we have. And we especially need more non-technical contributors. If you looked at the documentation for Node.js, it's pretty sparse. It's not bad, but there could be a lot more, and I think the docs could be a lot better. And I think this is really, the docs are really important for bringing on new Node users. And so we need more contributors coming on board. But I think we can, since we have this open and governance structure in place now, I think we've really primed ourselves to bring on all these new people. And so basically, in short, Node is great, and it's getting better all of the time. Thanks.